Right. So hopefully a lot of the examples of the different studies that we looked at on the previous presentations have helped you better understand and appreciate the prevalence of racial bias in our society today. But the kind of counterpart to that is that not only do we need to recognize that people of color experience prejudice and discrimination as a result of racial bias, but also that white people experience privilege just because of the color of their skin. So white privilege refers to the benefits people receive simply by being part of the dominant group, in this case, the dominant race. Okay? It's important to note that access to white privilege is not necessarily determined whether you identify as a white person. Access to white privilege is often determined by how others label your race, right? So think back, for example, in the beginning of these video lectures, we talked about how up until the 1950s, for the census, the numerators, the people that would go door to door to collect information from the census, it was actually their job to ascribe you a racial category based simply off of what they thought you looked like. Now think about how misleading that could be. We looked at, I'm sure many of you know individuals who are people of color, but maybe have very fair skin. So maybe you would, if you didn't know their actual racial and ethnic background, you would assume that they might be white individuals. But indeed, they're people of color. And then vice versa. Maybe you know some people who are actually white in terms of their race, but they have darker skin and oftentimes get miscategorized as being Latino or Native American or African American, whatever the case may be. So it's important and interesting to think from a sociological perspective. You might actually be able to access white privilege even if you aren't white, if you quote unquote pass as white or get read as white during social interactions, right? So that's an important distinction to make. So that's just an example that I offer out. For example, I might identify as a white person, but if my skin tone is very dark, people may label and subsequently treat me as a racial minority. Similarly, a person who identifies as a racial minority may have fair skin and be labeled and treated as a white person. Okay? Having white privilege does not mean that life is always sunshine and rainbows. So when I say that, a lot of people say, well, yeah, I might be white, but I'm still experience marginalization or oppression in other aspects of my life. Maybe I'm white, but I still grew up poor, and I had to pull myself up by my bootstraps. That very well may be the case. And acknowledging that you have white privilege does not take away from any other forms of oppression or marginalization that you have experienced. What white privilege is, though, is a guarantee that you will never experience discrimination, oppression, prejudice, marginalization because of the color of your skin. You will never be at a disadvantage in our society for being white, ever. You will never experience oppression or institutionalized discrimination for being a white person in the United States. Now, I can already anticipate that some of you might be countering with, well, what about affirmative action policies? I might not get a job because companies are reserving so many spaces for people of color, or because colleges are only admitting so many white people so they can ensure that they're including people of color in these spots. To which one would have to reply, well, maybe that feels like you're being discriminated against, but remember what the United States of America was built off of. Slavery, racism. People of color have experienced centuries of institutionalized discrimination. And so the fact that finally now, hundreds of years later, our society is trying to correct for that, even if that means over adjusting in certain situations, reserving more positions for people of color or other oppressed groups in certain jobs at certain colleges and universities, doesn't that seem like a justifiable response to the centuries of murder and brutality that people of color have had to experience? Doesn't that seem fair, right? And also, how can we ever expect to achieve racial equality if we don't offer some incentives or even special treatment in instances for groups of people that have faced centuries of oppression, right? How do we expect a group, think of it this way. If we have for centuries been suppressing opportunities for racial minorities, how can we expect them to automatically achieve equality if they've never been given an advantage in their entire lives? As a white person, we have been given advantages every day of our lives. Every single day, we are given countless advantages still today. So the fact that a few companies and schools are putting affirmative action policies in place to reserve a certain number of positions for people of color, it's not only fair, it's damn right deserved, right? It should be the case across all platforms that people of color are given a leg up on the competition because they have been oppressed and marginalized since the beginning, the founding of our nation. So these are just a few of many, many examples of what white privilege is. This week I asked you to read the original, one of the original writings on white privilege by Peggy McIntosh, which was called Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, and in that reading, McIntosh highlights 50 different ways that white people automatically are privileged every single day that people of color experience oppression in. And I'm just going to highlight a few of those and add a few more. So white privilege is being able to go shopping without having a sales associate keep an eye on me because I look like a potential shoplifter. Never had that happen. My partner, who is a person of color, has that happen to him almost every time we go into a store. A sales associate will walk around and keep an eye on him. I've never been followed around when I go to the mall. Right? I never have. White privilege is finding hair care products in the actual hair care aisle of the store rather than having to go to the ethnic hair care aisle. White privilege is being able to easily find a flesh tone bandage in any first aid kit. White privilege is being able to walk down the sidewalk without having people cross to the other side of the street out of fear that I'll mug them. White privilege is accurately learning about the history of my race in school and consistently seeing my race represented in all of my textbooks. White privilege is frequently seeing and hearing my race speaking as a voice of authority in politics and education. White privilege is not having the fear of potentially being shot by a police officer if I get pulled over for a routine traffic violation. White privilege is knowing that just because Ted Bundy and Jeffrey Dahmer were rapists and serial killers, other people won't automatically assume that I and all of my white friends are as well. White privilege is having great-great-grandparents who are legally allowed to own property and establish wealth that could be passed down to my parents. And having white privilege is the ability to choose to remain willfully ignorant to systemic racism because it will never affect me personally in a negative way. Right? These are all advantages that as a white person, I and millions of other Americans are afforded. If you are a person of color, these are probably things that you experience potentially on a daily basis. So think of that. The next time you're quick to defend whiteness as being disadvantaged or discriminated against, recognize the privileged position that you are coming from in our society and do one of those self-audits, right? Question, why am I getting defensive about this? Probably the answer is because it's not comfortable to recognize that in being ignorant about the privilege that our whiteness affords us, we've been able to get through this life without having to ever think critically about the harm that it's causing to other people. So it's important. The first step in getting rid of racism in our society and restricting racial bias is first recognizing how we contribute to these problems. Quickly, let's talk about theoretical perspectives on race. Functionalism questionably argues that racial prejudice and discrimination are functional for a society because they produce in-group solidarity, meaning they allow us to feel a sense of sameness or togetherness with other members of our race. Again, functionalism doesn't really seem to carry a lot of valuable solutions to any of the problems that we're talking about in current context. Conflict theory, again, more practical here. They argue that access to power and scarce resources such as income and wealth are largely affected by race, specifically white people have privilege in these areas. Having access to white privilege affords power to white people, while racism impacts the ability of people of color to achieve upward social mobility. And symbolic interactionism would suggest that the unconscious meanings and biases that we attach to race are learned through social interactions. So since the racial bias and the social stereotypes that we learn are a result of our socialization, luckily we do have the result to re-socialize ourselves, to expose ourselves to different ways of thinking, to lessen our racial biases, and to hopefully rid society of some of the institutionalized racism that's built into our institutions. So lastly, what can white people do? This is a link up here to a website called Teaching Tolerance that offers a million different suggestions about how to become more tolerant, how to recognize the biases that we have as a society. So I would encourage you to check that out if this is something you're interested in. But what are some specific things that white people could do? Well, first of all, we can not take it personally or use our own discomfort as an excuse to disengage from what I said. are uncomfortable conversations. If your instincts tell you that it's more comfortable to retreat, reassure yourself that you're not racist. Think instead, what is something that I can do to help, right? Again, it's not comfortable, but it's only going to get better if we lean into this discomfort and recognize the bias that we all hold in society. Second thing we can do is educate ourselves and others. Just as we shouldn't expect people of color to take the lead on speaking out against racism, we should not expect them to have to educate us either, right? While it's okay to ask questions to people of color who have expressed a willingness to answer them, we all have the power to educate ourselves. Being a part of this class, you're already taking the first step towards that, but take it even further. Try and read books, watch movies or TV shows or documentaries, listen to podcasts, etc., that about race and racism, specifically those that are produced by people of color, and share the knowledge that you gain in your privileged status of being a college-educated student with your family and friends or others who you think would benefit from a more nuanced understanding of this. And then lastly, learn when to stand up, when to amplify, and when to speak out, okay? It's important to note that we don't need to dominate this conversation as white people. We should be using our privilege to lift up the voices and the perspectives of people of color and to advocate on their behalf. We're going to conclude today by watching one final video here that's a good example of the power of speaking up and what it can do to address these inequalities.
My sister-in-law, who's half black, half white, but looks white, blue eyes, whiter than most white folks, very white. She and I, we kind of grew up together. We raised our children together. So they're first cousins, and it's a wonderful, very, very multicultural family. So we're going in a Safeway one day. And Kathleen, my sister-in-law, is in front of me. And she's, writing a check for her groceries. Now, my daughter, who at the time was 10 years old, was standing with me, and I was directly behind her, getting ready to get my groceries. So Kathleen comes up, and the checker, who is a strawberry blonde, freckled, very delightful, warm, the checker, this young woman, is talking to Kathleen. Hey, how you doing? This is a nice day today. They're just chatting up. And she says, yeah. So Kathy writes her check, and she steps off to the side with her groceries because she's waiting for me. Of course, again, Kathleen looks white, right? So I come up. No conversation. She looks up at me. Absolutely no, just a little chatter. And I write my check. My daughter, however, is 10, notices immediately the difference in how she responds to me. So I write my check, and she goes, I'm going to need 2 pieces of ID. At which point, my daughter looks at me, and she gets very, very embarrassed, and tears are kind of coming up in her eye, like, Mommy, you're not gonna let her do this. Why is she doing this to us, right? So I'm trying to figure out what I should do, because behind me are 2 elderly white women, right? And I'm thinking, okay, so then I become the angry black woman, right? And they're gonna be, and I'm just trying to second guess all the drama. So then I just give her the 2 pieces of ID. I said, some things you gotta choose your battles, right? And then it gets worse. She pulls out the bad check book, right? So this is the book that shows the people who've written bad checks. So she starts searching for my license in the bad checks, at which point it's just out of control now. Just as I'm standing there, trying to decide what to do, and it's really deeply humiliating. Now my daughter is in full-blown emotionally upset, who's 10. My sister-in-law walks back over. And she steps in and she says, excuse me, why are you doing this? And the checker goes, well, what do you mean? She goes, why are you taking her through all of these changes? Why are you doing that? She goes, well, this is our policy. She goes, no, it's not your policy because you didn't do that with me. Oh, well, I know you've been. She goes, no, she's been here for years. I've only lived here for 3 months. And so at this point, the 2 white elderly ladies go, oh, I can't believe what this checker has done with this woman. It is totally unacceptable. At which point the manager walks over. So the manager walks over and says, is there a problem here? And then my sister-in-law again responds. She goes, yes, there is a problem here. Here is what happened. So you see, she used her white privilege. And even though Kathleen is half black and half white, she recognizes what that means. And she made the statement. She pointed out the injustice. And she, as a result of that one act, influenced everyone in that space. But what would have happened? I can't know for certain had the black woman said, this is unfair. Why are you doing this to me? Would it have had the same impact? But Kathleen knew that she walked through the world differently than I did. And she used